So some of you may be wondering why we still have Easter lilies at the front. And if you read my midweek message, you might have been surprised to hear a variation on the old adage, it ain't over till it's over, or it ain't over till a certain lady sings. I wrote in the midweek message, it ain't over till flames of fire come down from heaven, which is a little dramatic, but that's exactly the truth about the Easter season. For those of you who didn't grow up in a Christian liturgical tradition, like me, you may not know that Easter is not just a Sunday morning where we dress up in pretty clothes and hunt Easter eggs. It's actually a 50-day season that starts on Easter Sunday and goes until Pentecost. So that'll be on June 8th this year, and we have a special guest preacher who's going to be coming that day to celebrate the birth of the church. Pentecost is actually the birthday, the founding of the Christian church, of the tradition from which we spring. So this Easter season, I'd like to invite you to join me for a bit of an extended meditation on what happened last Sunday and what is happening now. What happens in these 50 days between the empty tomb and the birth of the church? As we think about Jesus' death and resurrection and what it took for his followers to form that very first Christian community, I'd like to invite us all to think about some tough questions. And so it is in the next few weeks that I'll be asking you a question. Today, Mary, you've already heard a preview of the question. It's about, what do I need to let go of? About the fact that new beginnings sometimes require us to let go of something old or something familiar. Next week, I'll be talking to you about Thomas. He has the bad rap of doubting Thomas. And we're going to talk about what it takes for us to have faith or to actually believe. I'm going to propose that doubt can be a double-edged sword. It can be something empowering and questioning, pushing you to seek deeper, but also it can be paralyzing. So we'll discuss doubt next week. We'll go on to talk about Simon Peter and the fishermen who receive a home-cooked breakfast from Jesus on the seashore one morning. Jesus now in his resurrected, non-bodily form. And I'll ask the question, are we ready to put action to our hearts? Are we ready to put feet to our faith? What's it going to take for us to get off the seashore and get moving in the world? And then finally, I'll invite you to join me on the road to Emmaus, where we'll talk about where we're headed and how we're going to get there, about setting direction and setting off. There'll be one little break in that series. There's a special holiday on May 11th called Mother's Day. But we'll be also thinking about a new question that day. What is a mother? And I'll invite you all to redefine motherhood. So if there are any of you who have the tradition of skipping church on Sunday morning of Mother's Day for any reason, I'll invite you to join us that day as we think about how it takes a whole village to love and equip our young people. So that's what you have to look forward to in the next few weeks of the Easter season. But let's get back to today's scripture. We find Mary at the empty tomb. Last week, Mary was the first one to the tomb in the darkness of Easter morning. As you might remember, she ran off to tell the disciples about the emptiness, and Simon Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, whom we think is John, raced back to the tomb to have a look for themselves. And their reactions were quite different. We talked last week about Mary's shock and her disbelief, and about John's paralyzation, how the empty tomb stunned him, and also about Simon Peter's reaction as he barreled into the tomb, eager to see what happens, eager to begin, whatever next steps are coming their way. And I made the analogy between the empty tomb and our flood from last September. Between that which we have lost and where there's emptiness in our lives and our own reactions to resurrection, to new beginnings, whether those reactions include a mix of shock and disbelief, fear and paralyzation, or eagerness to get ready, get moving, get this town cleaned up and back into shape. That scripture last week ended with verse 10, which said, "Then the disciples returned to their homes." Now I wonder, did Mary follow them to the tomb and return with them? Did she stay in their homes where she had first found them? Or did she come back later? I'm not sure, because the very next verse, verse 11, which you just heard, starts with Mary standing by the empty tomb, weeping. She speaks to two angels that she sees in the tomb. And it puzzles me that this seems like a very normal conversation. I don't know how I would react if I was staring into empty darkness and saw two bright figures that I thought to be angels. It makes me wonder about whether or not Mary is in grief and grieving, or whether this is a literal, actual, true story. I'm not sure. But what I know is that when she says to these two beings, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him," Mary isn't quite ready to live into this unfathomable mystery. She sees the darkness, and she knows the tomb is empty, but she's not quite there yet. And she must be thinking about Jesus' last teachings. She witnessed him raise Lazarus from the dead. She was there at the Last Supper to hear about the water and the wine that Jesus would share with us again in heaven, how he taught his disciples that he was the resurrection and the life, and that he would soon ascend to heaven and be with them in the future. Mary's heard all the teachings, but still she's in shock as she stands in darkness, looking at the emptiness in her own life, the hole that her missing teacher has left. And she sees then a gardener, a man. Perhaps she recognizes his voice. Perhaps she sees but doesn't want to see. We're not quite sure yet if the realization has dawned on Mary where her state of shock is when she clings to the past and says to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." It's strange, all the things that must be going through Mary, the thoughts of the last week, of the crucifixion, of the death and the burial of Christ, of her loneliness, the way that everything that she had ever known for the past years was ripped away from her in one instant. She, like other women and men, had followed Jesus around the countryside, listening to his ministry, listening to his messages, his revolutionary messages of love and peace and hope, and now all of a sudden she's alone. And I can imagine she must have turned her back to him, to this gardener, to this man she sees in the tomb, because the scripture says that Jesus says to her then, "Mary." And she turns and she answers him in Hebrew, "Rabbi." She recognizes him. She turns to look full in the face of Jesus, and she sees that the darkness is not as dark as she had thought, that the emptiness and the loss is not what she had imagined. And so she reaches out for him the way she must have done time and time again in their relationship. They must have shared many loving touches or embraces. And in this moment, she's filled with joy, and she reaches out to him, "Rabbi, teacher." And his response must have shocked her yet again. "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended. There's nothing here for you to grab onto." Sometimes when we think of that response of Jesus, it seems cold. It seems to lack compassion. But I propose this morning that that's not actually the truth. I don't think that Jesus is trying to hurt Mary, to harm her, or to stay distant or aloof from her in some way. He needs her to understand that just as she has seen him, he has seen her. And there is a reaction that's expected. I found a poem this week by my friend Jan Richardson, who's a Methodist minister in Florida, on her website called The Painted Prayer Book. It's called Seen, and I'd like to share it with you. You had not imagined that something so empty could fill you to overflowing. And now you carry the knowledge like an awful treasure, or like a child that roots itself beneath your heart. How the emptiness will bear forth a new world that you cannot fathom, but on whose edge you stand. So why do you linger? You have seen, and so you are already blessed. You have been seen, And so you are the blessing. There is no other word that you need. There is simply to go and tell. There is simply to begin. We find ourselves today at the beginning of our own Easter stories. Our own stones rolled away, staring into inky darkness, wondering what new life will spring out of loss or change. But before we can begin, we must let go. Many people talk about the way things were, the way things have always been. And that's comforting. It's comforting to know that some things never change. But in this moment, Jesus is about to ascend to heaven. And he knows, and he needs Mary to know, that they can't go back to their loving embraces. They can't return to the way things were. In this new world, there is a change. And Jesus asks, what is changing in your life right now? After the flood, after a long cold winter, after a relationship begins or ends, after some period of darkness or suffering, what is it that you're being asked to let go of? Perhaps it's a way of seeing or of doing things. Perhaps it's a relationship or a habit that you have. Maybe, like Mary, Jesus is speaking directly into all of our lives, that we need to let go of our own pain and our shock and our weeping. Maybe we need to let go and get moving. He has work for us all to do, and we can't open our eyes and our hands and our hearts to see what needs to be done while we're still gripping tightly onto pains that we've suffered, injustices or indecencies. Sometimes we have to forgive. We have to simply let go. Sometimes the work he's asking us to do is a small sacrifice, and sometimes it's a huge undertaking. Mary was the first to see Jesus resurrected, the first to see him alive again in some form, the first to go and tell the good news. She was the first evangelist. She shared the gospel with many. She wasn't a trained speaker. She wasn't even one of the 12 chosen disciples of Christ. But she was the right person in the right place at the right time, who was willing to hear the voice of God and to respond faithfully and effectively to do what Jesus asked. I invite us all to rephrase the end of Jan's poem for ourselves. We have all seen God moving, and so we are all already blessed. We have all been seen by God, and so we are all the blessed.